What is the testing approach professional engineering teams select when they work with production environment? And this approach starts actually from the ticket creation in general. And the idea here is, if you can understand the acceptance criteria of the task, then you can understand what would be the test cases and how to test efficiently the implementation that you have written, because there is a definition of ready. And you as a developer, you have to get the full understanding of the ticket and how to implement it and how then to test it. And it's either you can test it or it can be tested by the QA engineer if your team is relatively big. Usually in the small teams, QA is a role. It's not a position, it's not a separate person. And this role can be taken by several people in the team. For example, it can be taken by user experience, user interface designer. This role also can be taken by front-end engineer, even back-end engineer, or project manager, magic manager, or product manager. So it depends on the team structure. And based on the team structure, you will prioritize the work, and especially QA. And prioritization of work and QA will also be reflected in the environments that you have. So you might have a development environment, you might have then a QA, a separate QA environment, or you might have the acceptance environment or production environment. Usually, it highly depends on the product you are building. For example, if your product demands a separate testing environment, such as a separate development environment for each developers, that are mostly desktop applications and incredibly difficult desktop applications that would require that setup, you will end up in a dedicated QA server where QA will connect. So you have your own development server where you develop stuff, then you take the feature branch, you deploy to QA, and then to QA environment, and then QA comes to the place, and then QA implements everything, implements the testing or runs the testing or do the testing on against that environment. So as I mentioned before, our QA starts not when the task is considerably done, but our QA starts when we write our ticket. Because when we write our ticket, we want to write the motivation for the ticket, we want to write acceptance criteria for the ticket, and we want also to write description. And if we are willing to bring our product to real success, we most probably going to write the test cases, like testing scenario, how the developers are going to verify that feature is complete. So you are a very happy engineer if you work in an environment and your product owner, business analyst, or whoever role you have in the team writes the ticket with acceptance criteria and testing cases. You solve the puzzle, you are in top 98%. No one does this. Well, most of the people don't do that, because most of the people just provide the headline of the ticket because they never plan their work and they don't have the backlog and they don't plan iterations for 3 or 4 months. They just have enough work for the next week. And this is a dangerous project, so they can survive and they can work efficiently, but the testing there is very disturbing. And sometimes we have to spend more time on testing than on development, because we never describe the feature at the ideation point, and we have to come up with some edge cases and covering some scenarios when the feature is considerably delivered. So imagine we are in a situation when we have the ticket that has clear motivation, descriptions, and acceptance criteria, and the test cases, and now we're taking it in the progress. So when I'm as a developer, I work on this task, I want to fulfill the acceptance criteria. I want to understand that this code that I am deploying will work in the predetermined scenario, meaning that it will follow acceptance criteria. And then when my colleague or some other developer with the role of QA, they take this task from code review to quality assurance, they will follow the test scenario, trying to reproduce acceptance criteria. And in this situation, this is ideal combo. And when they go through the steps that were predefined, and it works as should be accepted, and then person can conclude that this work is finished, ticket is implemented, and can pass on to the business decision maker, who will then finally identify whether the work was done or not. In Calm, for example, ready for release or need acceptance. It depends on the board structure that you have. Most probably you end up in a situation in the well-structured team who works together for some time, you probably will end up that 80% of the tickets that are in need acceptance or ready for release are confirmed by the product owner or founder of the company. It depends on the size of the company, right? Because you work together for a long time and you understand each other, and then you can reduce actually the amount of written text in the ticket, because you start to understand each other better, and now you understand the certain phrases and idioms that you use in the ticket, and now you can have fun and still deliver the thing that is needed. So to approach QA successfully, you want to write the ticket properly. Everyone in the team has to get the understanding what should be done in scope of the ticket and how to test it. And then regarding testing, you can implement different testing strategies based on the complexity of the project. And we can talk about fintech, we can talk about e-commerce, or we can talk about software as a service, or any other tools or platforms or instruments that require validation of the code. Usually what you want to do is you want to select a single, well, first of all, you want to do the customer journey mapping if it wasn't done, or user journey mapping if it wasn't done, but most probably it was already done before you started the implementation. So now you know the critical path of success. You know exactly a couple things on your platform that customer has to do at any time. So what you want to do is that you want to be sure that at all times customer can perform the actions that were designed for him to perform. So you can make a decision whether it's unit testing, whether it's an integration testing, end-to-end testing, or whether it's a combination of things and you want to use Cucumber and go ahead and do everything. A very, very good mental exercise that no one likes, especially when you are pressed in time by the management, and today you are always pressed in time by the management because of AI. You want to write test-driven development. OpenAI or any other large language models are not competent to do this job. They cannot do it. Still, only humans, fortunately, can completely write the right test-driven development or test-driven development. And this will save you a lot of time, and this product will be maintained very well, and you really want to do it. But it's a huge mental effort. It's really difficult to do. Not from the technical perspective, but from the psychological perspective, because all the time you begin with the API implementation, you want to write the test cases. And in these test cases, you want to come up with all possible situations when this code should fail or should work positively, because you always write negative scenarios and positive scenarios. And this is what you do with unit testing. Then you run the unit tests probably with mockup data locally. However, you can run locally again. However, one of my recommendations would be to run this unit tests against a real environment, for example, against development environment. And then you end up that you cannot run this in pipelines. So you want to implement a separate server where you run the automation tests all the time. And this is considerably the best practice. So you always have the target QA environment, which is 24/7 attacked or being used by the automation tests that you run. And this is very good, because anytime you want to release any new feature and you create a merge or pull request from development to QA, you will run some basic tests that do not require some real data from the backend, but it will just go for the testing, test the functions against some mock data, for example, some complicated functions with high schematic complexity that you're not sure are well maintained. And then after the pipeline, you will hit QA, and then in QA, your automation jobs will just run against new features or existing features to verify that you didn't break anything with the new code, and this new code work accordingly, so it doesn't fail the use cases that you have described and have been written in the ticket before, right? So when you have that, you deliver the code after it from QA to the UAT, and then in UAT, most probably your product owner is going to verify that implementation was correct, and after the successful manual test, most probably that's going to be a manual test, they will conclude that it can be released to production. And then you just release in production on Friday night, right? I'm joking, don't do that. So another scenario is that you can have acceptance environment, but it's tested by the existing customer. So you have multi-tenant approach, and then you deploy to a certain pre-selected group of people, and then the customer can test it, and then they can provide the feedback, and then you take this feedback and you either check and verify and change some implementations that you already have written, or you just go ahead and push everything, most preferably with the green-blue deployment approach. And then if we talk about testing, I probably didn't cover the front-end testing. And regarding front-end front-end testing, it might be necessary to use two things. It's not necessarily front-end, but it's usually prerogative for the front-end developer. So you can use end-to-end testing. You can write everything with Playwright or with Cypress, or you can use some Enzyme or React testing library. It really depends on what you want to test. For example, if you are testing the user journey from end to end, probably you want to go ahead and use the end-to-end automation tool, and you just describe the steps that you want your application to go through to verify that you're testing. So you just define the steps you want your test to go through, and then at the end you just check if it was a positive scenario or negative scenario, and you just verify its completion without any errors or mistakes. And you're good to go. And also, again, you want to use a separate environment to run end-to-end automation tests against your code, because this is incredibly useful when you have when you want to have a reliable application. You want to write testing all the time against some environment. This way you will not let anything go through. However, to not let anything go through your testing environment, you want to have a certain test coverage percentage of the code base. So it's usually considered 80% of the code base should be covered with tests. However, it's strictly optional and really depends on the team and the environment in which you're working. Sometimes it can be more, sometimes it can be less, sometimes it can be only crucial features of the platform that you have delivered to your customers. One important thing I didn't mention is about roles. The important note here that if you work together with someone on the project, you are two people only, without any QA or any role or any other person who can take the QA role. I suggest that the testing is performed by the developer who didn't write the code. It's not because they're trying to hide their mistakes or errors. It's because they have a bias. They have a confirmation bias. They think that they covered all the edge cases and they are sure it works. However, in reality, they forget something. So the other person testing other one's code is better than the developer himself testing the code. Because this is a false statement, like why are you delivering bugs, why are you delivering, just test your application well and you won't deliver bug. Probably it's impossible. I think we have a certain mental capacity or a certain mental state that brings us to the point that if we wrote the code and we didn't think about certain use case that can appear, when we test we also don't think about this use case. We rarely do that. So this is why test-driven development is very important, because you are not working on the implementation of the feature, you're working testing with the feature. So it changes your mindset, and this creates the opportunity to cover all cases, all edge cases before. But this is a very mentally challenging approach and it will drain you at the beginning. However, if you go ahead and have this approach for some time, I promise you it will be simpler and easier for you, and you will like it, and you will be ambassador of TDD.